Hi, welcome to Conversations. I'm Bill Crystal, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Diana Schaub, professor of political science at Loyola University of Maryland, author of terrific works on Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Montesquieu, and others. And we had a previous conversation about Frederick Douglass, which I highly recommend people watch either before or after this conversation, in conjunction with this conversation on Lincoln.
The two greatest men of the 19th century, in my opinion.
Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Greatest Americans or greatest men?
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to go with greatest men? Okay,
I'm going to go with greatest men.
I have to make my case for Tocqueville at some point, but we can. That's a good conversation. Well, they are awfully impressive. And Lincoln, of course, is very daunting. How do we cover him in one conversation? We can't, but I guess we thought we might focus on three speeches: the Lyceum speech he gives when he's 28 years old, I think, and then Gettysburg and the second inaugural, the two great speeches of his presidency, and sort of what he's trying to. We get at least scrape the surface of what he's trying to accomplish in these speeches in terms of his understanding of America, equality, and so forth. So, Lyceum speech?
Yeah,
he gives that when he's, 28 years old?
Yes, a young man. He's already an elected official. He's serving his second term in the Illinois House, and he's invited to give a lecture as a kind of rising local dignitary. More well-known outsiders were also invited to give these addresses. Emerson apparently made an appearance at the Springfield Lyceum. We don't know whether Lincoln was in attendance at that or not. But
and we have the text of the speech because Lincoln seems to have. It gets printed, I think, in the newspaper. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. That would have been the tradition. And we also know that Lincoln was extremely careful to make sure that his things got into print, and he supervised their production very carefully. So things like his use of italics, which he likes to use a lot, gives kind of indication to his meaning. And so you get quite a bit of that in this speech. So I think it's clear that it was meant to be heard, but also very much meant to be read and still worth our reading and studying.
Yeah. And this speech, I think, wasn't so famous back in the day, so to speak. I mean,
that's right. It was sort of rediscovered, in part because it seems a prefiguration of his own role in the Civil War. At a certain point, he speaks of a person of great ambition who would be willing either to emancipate slaves or enslave free men. A person of great ambition wouldn't so much distinguish between whether he did one or the other. Great ambition is neutral. And so Lincoln's own act of emancipating the slaves was read back into this speech, and the question has to arise, would Lincoln have been willing to enslave free men if he had not had the opportunity to free the slaves? Of course, there are some anti-Lincoln folks who think that he did enslave free men. So this has become a speech that's a rather contentious speech, I think,
that's my impression.
The interpretation of it.
And so, and it's the topic of it, which I think he's given, right? Is
no,
oh, he chooses.
He chooses this topic. Yeah, and this is again very characteristic of Lincoln. There's no preamble. There's no wind up. He goes directly to his topic. He tells you, as a subject for the remarks of the evening, the perpetuation of our political institutions is selected. That's his topic sentence. His thesis sentence doesn't come until a bit later.
I think the perpetuation of our political institutions is maybe not the typical topic that a 28-year-old state legislator would take, but kind of a big, I mean, it's interesting how just as such a young man, he was thinking so broadly and deeply too, but about the meaning of America, not about simply, am I a Whig or am I a Jacksonian or what's my policy agenda,
And actually that's interesting because Van Buren's first term is just beginning, but Van Buren is sort of the hand-picked successor to Jackson and his two terms. So from the Whig perspective, and Lincoln is a Whig, this is a kind of continuation of Jacksonian tyranny. But Lincoln here does not take at all a narrowly partisan approach. But he is, I think, in conversation, maybe especially with Jackson, and Jackson's farewell address had raised this question about the perpetuation of our political institutions. So I think there's a kind of key moment later where Lincoln is issuing a certain correction to what Jackson calls for.
And what should people look for in this speech as they go read it? I mean, what's
Well, you should look for what's in it,
Yes, that's
which
good.
I guess means reading it carefully. He is engaged in a kind of diagnosis of the dangers of democracy. So the current danger, which he sees as the advent of mobocracy or mob rule. It's very concerned about these incidents of vigilante justice that are breaking out all over the country. So he's concerned about those current dangers, and then he has a certain solution that he recommends. And then there's a second half of the speech where he's concerned about future dangers, and that involves an analysis of the passions, both the passions of the great and the passions of ordinary folks. And then there is a kind of solution to that. So there are sort of two diagnoses and two sets of solutions, and there's a question of how those two sets of solutions accord with one another. So reverence is the first solution, and reason is the second one. But we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves.
No, that's a very good, very clarifying summary for me, because it's always been somewhat bewildering. I mean, you can read it carefully and see a lot of irony and things going on, but the overall structure is somewhat mystifying, or it doubles back on itself, I guess.
Yes.
So there's almost a second start of it when he gets beyond. I think you're right. The first part is fairly, not conventional, it's too strong, but I mean, it's mob rule, and therefore we need to have respect for the reverence for the rule of law. That's kind of but then it really veers off.
Takes another turn, a deeper turn.
So explain that turn.
Well, maybe we could just start by saying something about this initial topic, the perpetuation of our political institutions. So in the course of considering perpetuation, which means, what does this generation need to do? What do we need to keep on going? How do we maintain this government? It requires a reflection on how we got to this point. So it requires a reflection on the founding, and it requires a reflection on how the republic might be lost, the destruction of a republic. So it turns out that perpetuation and consideration of perpetuation entails a comprehensive political reflection on founding, unfounding, possibly refounding. So I think it's a pretty spectacular performance from a young man, from anyone maybe. So we mentioned doubling. There are many moments of doubling in the speech. In the beginning, the first treatment of the founders, it seems that founding is the higher task, higher than perpetuation. Right, theirs was the task, and nobly they performed it. Right, 'tis ours only to transmit. Right, we are just the inheritors. We're lucky. Just don't blow it. Right, but later there is a reconsideration of the founders, and there he says, well, really, what they achieved is not much to be wondered at, because it had all kinds of props. It was propped up by the passions. It just so happened that the self-interest of the founders, their quest for fame and celebrity, was in accord with the common good, with the establishment of republicanism. But that won't be the case in the future. In the future, men of great ambition, it won't be sufficient just to be a custodian in the house of the fathers. Right? It's really spectacular what he says. Right. He says, well, there are lots of great and good men, who would be satisfied with being a representative or being president of the United States. Those are people who lack lofty ambition, people who would be satisfied with being president, right? But they don't belong to the family of the lion and the tribe of the eagle. Right? People like that would scorn to serve in the footsteps of any predecessor. So Lincoln is very worried about this individual of overweening ambition. What is the fate of a person of the founding type who comes along after the founding?
So there's an analysis on two levels I mean, this is doubling if you want to get fancy. He seems to analyze both the incentives or ambitions of the few, let's call it, which, as you say, at the founding seemed to be in conjunction with setting up a republic, and Washington will be revered, so that's all fine. And then we'll come back to that, I suppose, how problematic those people find the situation now. But then there's the public as well, who at the beginning, I think Lincoln does stress, it's not quite so hard to get them loyal to the new country because they have memories of the battles and a kind of patriotism from that, right?
Yeah, so the issue there, he says, at the time of the founding, there were all of these passions, negative passions, revenge and hatred, and but all of those passions could be directed against the British. So at the time of the founding, the passions of the people served the revolution, served the establishment of republicanism. But after, those passions will turn inward, will become the basis of divisiveness. So he says that now and in the future, passion is our enemy. We really have to turn to reason.
So there are the few and the so there's a problem
the few
with
and the many.
few,
He evaluates
and with the
right.
many.
He evaluates the future dangers both from the perspective of the few and the perspective of the many.
Yeah, that's kind of striking too for a 28-year-old in the
In a
America
democracy.
Tocqueville has just visited, where everyone's a Democrat, with a little d.
Yeah.
And, yeah, he's so aware of that distinction.
Yeah, and in fact, it's interesting to compare Lincoln and Tocqueville on ambition, because Tocqueville's worry seems to be that there won't be lofty ambition, right? That ambition will just become mediocre and directed only towards material goods. And so Tocqueville looks for a way really to preserve lofty ambition,
Right.
whereas Lincoln says, no, there really is a permanent human nature, and we have to assume that individuals of this type will arise. So it's not a matter of, for Lincoln, of quashing that ambition. It will be there and it will arise. You have to prepare the people to meet it. And so he says the people have to be prepared. You have to have general intelligence and sound morality and reverence for the Constitution and laws, and those three things together will enable the people to reject the individual of overweening ambition. In other words, to enable them really to have some kind of insight into tyranny.
And that's based on reason, he says.
Claim,
as opposed to the kind
yeah,
of memory,
or
which we'll no longer have living memories of the revolution, and people can't think back to the fight.
Right. Yeah. So that section is very interesting and very beautifully written. But he seems to say that history will not be sufficient.
Right.
So he says that the scenes of the revolution will have a different standing once the living history is gone. Right. He says the living history that carries its authenticity in the limbs mangled and the scars of wounds received. In other words, once grandfather with his Civil War scars is gone, you can't tell those tales any longer.
Revolutionary War scars.
Yeah. So it. Did I say Civil War? Yeah. Sorry, there's a big difference between those and their standing. It is interesting. He seems to say that the stories as they come through the books will not be enough, and something needs to replace that. So in a way, he's saying that the founders, while they wanted to prove the possibility of a people to be self-governing, that experiment really has not yet been successful because it was supported by these other props. And we don't really know the capacity of a people to govern itself until we can see that they are actually governing themselves. In other words, it depends on a kind of individual self-government. And that depends on the priority of reason.
I was thinking about this a few years ago. I won't embarrass myself. I tried to do the math in my head, but at some point, D-Day was about as much.
Yeah.
We were about as much after D-Day as Lincoln's speech was after the Revolution.
Yeah.
Lincoln's speech is 1838.
38.
and 38,
38, yeah.
which is 38 plus 26, so 64 years after the Revolution. So
Yeah.
about 10 years ago, that would have been D-Day.
Yes, so
And
we
it's
are...
a similar thing in a way. I
Right.
kind of feel that we don't have obviously many World War II vets. We don't have many Korea vets. So it's not just the fight against totalitarianism, both the right and the left, is somewhat now a history book question, not a lived thing.
Yeah, we
as
are
much.
living through this same kind of moment. The
Yeah.
greatest generation will soon be gone.
Right.
The last living World War I veteran died a few years ago.
World War II will be
Yeah,
soon.
and World War II
unfortunately.
will
And
be-
then in terms of the
be soon.
presidents, Bush, Reagan, that whole generation, obviously, from Kennedy through George H.W. Bush and
Yeah.
so forth. So what? So what's the solution for the few and the many? I mean, that seems a little less clear than the problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's where he says that reason is the solution, right? Passion has helped us in the past, can do so no longer in the future. It will be cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason.
But is that possible in politics?
Well,
I ask as a student
yeah.
of.
Well, he is certainly aware of people's resistance to reason. He gives speech after speech, taking people through the arguments, and they don't listen to him. He tells them already in 1838, he warns them of what's coming, and we still get the Civil War. He gives the first inaugural where he pleads with them, and we still get the Civil War. So it may not be possible, but I think he is serious in telling us that really is the proof that is needed.
Well, the proof that you could preserve. But I'm struck at the end of the next last paragraph, as you said, reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws. But
yes,
reverence is not quite reason.
No, but I believe he thinks that reverence is a kind of reasonable passion, or maybe we have to think about how is he using this word passion, and he may not include everything within passion that we include. So he speaks sometimes about states of feeling, and he thinks that a certain state of feeling should be cultivated or developed. And he doesn't call that passion. In other words, he always uses passion to mean these negative passions. He says that it is reason that is molded into intelligence, morality, and reverence.
Right.
So reverence has a kind of reasonable basis. Or we could look at something like the Temperance Address, where he says that, where there he's talking about persuasion, and he gives a kind of theory of rhetoric. And he says that he's speaking against the temperance folks and maybe also the abolitionists who are constantly speaking in tones of denunciation. He says that doesn't persuade anybody, that just gets people's hackles up. So you have to first convince someone that you are his sincere friend. Therein is a drop of honey that catches his heart, which say what he will is the great high road to his reason. So there he argues that the heart is the high road to reason.
I guess I was
so there's more layers or complexity
Right.
here than just cold, unimpassioned reason.
right. And then at the end of that paragraph of Lyceum, the next last paragraph of Lyceum's speech, and then he kind of gets quite elevated in his rhetoric, and that we revered, that we improved to the last, we remained free to the last, that we revered his name to the last. So that sounds quite religious, if I can put it that way. And then, in fact, there's an explicit allusion to, apparently, the end of it shall be that which to learn the last trump shall awaken our Washington. So doesn't that sort of suggest the limits of reason? I guess you're more willing to concede that reverence can be reasonable than I am, maybe. But isn't this a sort of indication that you need a political religion? You can say it's based on reason. I mean, I think that would be reasonable to say, but there's a kind of acknowledgement of, let's call it the limits of reason, or a kind of the need for an attachment that goes.
He's getting awfully passionate about reason.
Right.
This is
right.
So we maybe got ahead of ourselves by not going through the discussion about mob law and the call for reverence.
Well, the problem is mob rule and taking the law into your own hands.
Yeah, and so why is that a problem? His account of that is kind of interesting, and again, there is a sort of doubleness. He initially introduces this mob rule as really horrifying, right? Repugnant to our humanity, and he tells the two stories. The story of what happened in Mississippi with all of these lynchings, and these lynchings sort of spiraling out of control. It sounds, he has this description of dead men seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside. It sounds like that the wonderful jazz song "Strange Fruit." Right. It's kind of a horrifying picture. And then he tells about the scene, the horror-striking scene in St. Louis. Let me just read that. A single victim was only sacrificed there. His story is very short and is perhaps the most highly tragic of anything of its length which has ever been witnessed in real life. A mulatto man by the name of McIntosh was seized in the street, dragged to the suburbs of the city, chained to a tree, and actually burned to death, all within a single hour from the time he'd been a free man, attending to his own business, and at peace with the world. So it gives this description of mob law in operation. And then he doubles back and he retells both stories.
Right.
And now he says, well, the direct consequences were really not of much account. If the plague were to come along and sweep all the gamblers from Vicksburg from existence, we would look upon that as a salutary event. These folks are not much to be missed. And then he says, the correct reasoning in regard to the burning of the Negro at St. Louis. So no longer a mulatto by the name of McIntosh, but a Negro at St. Louis who had committed an outrageous murder. He would have died by the course of the law a short time afterwards. So he says for him alone, it was probably as well the way it was.
Yeah. It's an amazing,
so why does
two
he
or
do
three
this?
paragraphs, a total
Yeah.
reversal almost, yeah.
So it seems to me he's giving a kind of illustration of passion. And he's showing, in fact, that he can tell a story in a way that makes us react passionately.
But a misleading story.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, because he says the correct reasoning is,
Right.
This guy was a murderer.
Right, so it's a good example of how you can...
How you can be misled.
Right.
So he's actually, and he has shown what was it that motivated the lynchers. What motivated the lynchers was their sense of justice. So now he's forcing Americans to think not only about that tyrant out there, but that they themselves have these tyrannical tendencies. Mob law is a kind of tyranny of the mass. So he wants us to shift from the direct consequences to thinking about the indirect consequences, the long term. What does this mean for our attachment to our nation? What does it mean for the status of the law? And you see Lincoln do this time and again in speeches, where he will contrast the direct effect of something with the indirect or the prospective effect of something. He does it in the Peoria Address, where he talks about the effect of Kansas-Nebraska Act and its principle, both its direct effect and its prospective principle. So he does it here, and this requires that we think through it with him rather than just acting, sort of reacting.
Right.
And then he takes us through it. What are the indirect effects? Well, the first is, of course, that the innocent could be lynched rather than the guilty. But then, more problematically even, is that the lawless in spirit are encouraged to become lawless in practice. So there's a kind of recognition that there are folks out there who are only being held in check by the coercion of the law. And once that's removed, they feel free to do what they like. And then, maybe even worse, is that the good men, right, the law-abiding, lose their trust and faith in the government. And this is what he's most worried about, the alienation of affection on the part of good citizens. So they are interested in security, and if popular government has this anarchic consequence, if it descends into mob rule, then those good citizens will look to a strong man. They will look to another form of government that can deliver that security and order. So he says that really is the test, to figure out how to reattach Americans to their government and law.
Which he then presses, as he says, and then he presses for a strict observance of the laws. Because even if they seem inconvenient, the rule of law is a terribly important principle to restrain the majority or a mob in a democracy.
Yeah, and not just inconvenient, but even when they're bad.
Right.
Even bad laws
right.
must be obeyed religiously for the sake of law altogether.
Which is a different attitude, incidentally, than one had than the founders, than the American people had in 1776, presumably. So there's a kind of, the perpetuation requires a slightly different stance, perhaps, than the founding, right?
Yeah, although Lincoln certainly believes there is a right of revolution.
Right.
So you would have to evaluate, are these particular bad laws made by a democracy, and therefore they are binding, right? Until you can convince the democracy otherwise, you are bound by those determinations of the majority. So the situation, the English case might be different. Those were not laws arrived at through self-government, but imposed without representation. But I think it's pretty clear that Lincoln thinks that the slaves are not bound by the laws of slavery. Mm-hmm. Right? It's democratic citizens who are bound by those determinations of the majority.
And so, what else should we say about this very interesting speech?
Well, maybe just that paragraph about reverence for the law and the way it contrasts with another one of our great moral lights, Martin Luther King Jr., who argues for civil disobedience. Right? An unjust law is not a law. And Lincoln, I think, is in fundamental disagreement with King about civil disobedience. This formulation here would seem to disallow civil disobedience. There's a right of revolution, right? But short of that, you must obey. You must obey a law which is really a law of your own making if you are living under a republican order.
Though whether the blacks were entirely involved in the making of the law is a fair question, I suppose.
Well, certainly the slaves are not, and even the status of free blacks, depending on their citizenship. Or you mean even at the time of King?
It's not like they had much of a vote in these laws, right? In the South, so.
Yeah, but then you might say, well, all right, is disobedience allowed to achieve the vote, but not maybe for things like segregation?
Yeah, but once they have the vote, they could take care of segregation. I mean, I'm not sure it was entirely, those two are entirely separable. But that's an interesting point.
Yeah, no, I mean, most of what King does not involve disobeying laws. Right? It's only very occasionally that the movement steps into actual disobedience of law. And so, in other words, nonviolent direct action, that's not civil disobedience.
Right. And even civil disobedience, it's been a long time since I've read King carefully at all, but even the kind of civil disobedience he calls for is ultimately for the sake of a reform that will allow for obedience, one could argue. I mean, so in that respect, it takes a longer view. I mean, it's not simply, this law is unjust, we're not obeying it, it must be changed tomorrow. It's more, this law is unjust as part of a pattern which needs to be fundamentally changed. But as part of it, once changed, or as it's being changed, there's a basic loyalty to the overall republic.
Yeah, he claims he's showing the utmost respect for the law
Right.
by violating the law in the way that he does it, lovingly, with the willingness to accept the penalty. But I still think there is a really fundamental
That's interesting.
disagreement here, and there were folks at the time of the civil rights struggle, including African American thinkers, who were not on board with this middle ground of civil disobedience.
Right.
The thinkers who are both more radical than King, like Malcolm X. Malcolm X says there is no halfway ground. It's either revolution or it's the ballot or the bullet. There's no in between. And on the more conservative side, there were those who argued that they could have achieved everything that was achieved by remaining within the law.
Interesting. Yeah. And of course, for King, the appeal to a certain kind of religious moral law, I suppose, is very important, which Lincoln does not seem to want to, in general, permit, I would say, right? You know, this sort of notion that you get to make your own judgment about what Christianity or religion tells you.
So, in fact, that is what the abolitionists are doing.
Right.
And Lincoln is very worried about their assault on constitutionalism. So the assault on constitutionalism is coming not only from the South and the Calhounites, but it's also coming from the North and the abolitionists. So maybe just one more thing is the paragraph after this, where he does raise the question of abolitionism. So I think this is where he is responding quite directly to Jackson. What Jackson had said in his farewell address is that Americans must be very careful not to offend the sensibilities of the Southerners with respect to slavery. And pretty clearly implying that Northerners have no right to denounce slavery. And if we want to keep the nation together, if we want to avoid this sort of polarization and sectionalism, you have to silence that moral sense. And Lincoln is not prepared to go there. So Lincoln believes that there is an obligation on the part of the federal government not to intervene with slavery in the slave states, right? But there is no obligation to silence one's moral sense.
Right.
And so this next paragraph, I think he's really trying to open up space for political conversation. So he says, there's no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law in any case that arises, as, for instance, the promulgation of abolitionism. Right? He just happened to pick that one out of a hat.
Right.
And remember, the incident that has just happened in Illinois just a few weeks before this was the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist, editor of a newspaper. He was murdered and the printing presses were thrown into the river. So officially Lincoln talks about St. Louis and Mississippi, but the incident that's uppermost in everyone's mind, it just occurred in Alton, Illinois, was the murder of an abolitionist. So he says, in any case that arises, as for instance the promulgation of abolitionism, one of two positions is necessarily true, that the thing is right within itself and therefore deserves the protection of all law and all good citizens, or it is wrong and therefore proper to be prohibited by legal enactments. And in neither case is the interposition of mob law either necessary, justifiable, or excusable. Now, Lincoln doesn't tell us here where he comes down on that question. He's just trying to open up space for reasonable conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. He doesn't sort of say, though, free speech should be protected. And, yeah, why not, though? I mean,
yeah, true. It's not an argument to.
Right.
Yeah, he actually seems to say if it were wrong, then we could
I've
prohibit
always
it
been struck
by
that.
legal
That seems
enactments.
strange.
It does seem strange. Partly, he may just he may want to offer people that option, but what he really wants to do is just get them to say, we have to raise the question of whether it's right or wrong or not.
Right. Well,
because if they raise the question of the rightness or wrongness of abolitionism, they must raise the question of the rightness or wrongness of slavery. And that's what he's wanting them to focus on.
Which somehow underlies a lot in this speech, even though it's not the focus.
Even though it's not,
mentioned, but it is mentioned, but not the focus, certainly, of the
Yeah, and the same thing is true of the Temperance Address. The official topic is the temperance movement and the rhetoric proper to this kind of moral reform, but the subterranean topic is slavery and abolitionism and their rhetoric, and whether there might be a better rhetoric to forward the anti-slavery cause.
And the Temperance Address is just a few years after.
A few years after this, 1842.
So, I mean, let's just take a minute on this, and if we don't get through all these other addresses, we can have a second conversation, because it's just so unbelievable that at age 28 and then at age 32, whenever he gives the Temperance Address, he's giving these so carefully thought through and carefully written speeches, and has reflected so much on popular government, the few and the many, the passions and reason. I mean, where does that come from? I mean, I guess it just comes from him being Lincoln, but I mean, do we know? We don't. I mean, is the myth sort of true? I mean, he doesn't really have much formal education, right? I mean,
no, he has the least formal education of any of our presidents, less than a year. You know, a few weeks, a few months here and there in a formal classroom. So he was. He didn't have much formal schooling, but I would argue that he was extremely well educated, and he was self-educated, and he went to great lengths to acquire that self-education. Lord Charnwood, author of my favorite biography of Lincoln, written in 1916, beautifully written. He talks about Lincoln's education, and he says that it was actually an advantage to him that he had few books, and that those few books were good books.
And do we know which ones particularly he
We know a little.
About?
The Bible and Shakespeare. He had some exposure to the main strands of the Western tradition because he had an anthology, Murray's English Reader, and so there would have been short snippets and selections from the Greeks and Romans, so a little Cicero and a little Demosthenes. There would have been a lot of English authors, Addison and Steele, English poets, Milton, Byron. He was not much of a novel reader, but he did like Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which he had as a young person. So that's kind of exposure to modern thought, I would say. He was a great lover of the poetry of Burns. There's a very fine book by Fred Kaplan called, what is it called? Lincoln as Writer, or The Making of a Writer, or something like that. But he sort of lays out everything that is known about what texts Lincoln had, at what point he was interested in them, and very nice insights about what he drew from them. So Burns was especially important, both for his humor, his ability to be moral without being moralistic, which you see in Lincoln, right? The ability to be moral without being moralistic. And the way in which humor can contribute to that, and his sort of large sense of humanity.
Never read any Burns. I guess I need to.
Lincoln could apparently cite it and do the brogue. Very, very, very well. Yeah.
And he knew the American text. And
and of course the American text. So there he had both Parson Weems's Life of Washington, and I think took a lot from that. Again, that's a text that's now thought to be just kind of hagiographic and over the top, and it is a little over the top, but there's a lot of value in it, and Lincoln learned a lot about Washington from it, especially since it gives the text of the farewell address. Lincoln had clearly pored over the farewell address of Washington. And he had Franklin's autobiography. So those are his sort of two heroes, Washington and Franklin. Yeah, and I think he gets a lot from Franklin also. So the importance that he puts on the virtue of resolution. If you remember that section from Franklin where he sketches out his take on the virtues, the 13 virtues, the fourth one is resolution. And Lincoln, at a certain point in his life as a young man, struggled with resolution. He felt that his bad behavior, his breaking off of his engagement to Mary Todd, had shown that he lacked resolution, and he actually refused to put himself forward politically until he had reacquired or had become confident that he could trust himself in his resolutions.
And then I suppose once he gets into public life, obviously he's well aware of the debates and what's going on.
Yeah, a great reader of newspapers and political pamphlets, in the same way that Washington is very much like that, immersed in the...
You can see that, obviously, in the speeches and so forth. And
reading the congressional record, he apparently memorized some speeches of Clay. Clay, he said, was his beau ideal of a statesman.
Yeah, it's a nice
even though his own rhetoric seems to me not much like Clay's at all, but...
Right. But he presents himself as a loyal supporter of Clay, at least. I mean, it's a nice eulogy to Clay.
Yeah, and the eulogy of Clay is also very, very interesting. And again, I think a very clear subtext there is slavery.
Right.
There's a battle going on over who gets to claim the legacy of Clay. The Democrats are trying to lay claim to it because they believe in compromise.
Right.
And Lincoln tries to turn the legacy of Clay away from compromise and towards the anti-slavery strand of Clay's thought.
And that's just before the Civil War, right?
That's
that's
52.
52. I thought it was.
That's 52. So it's actually before Peoria. It's before the Kansas-Nebraska
But he
Act.
says of Clay, which I agree is not. I mean, in a way, if you just read the history, Clay is this great senator who's always finding compromises. And then, but Lincoln's account of him is he loved America. Was it not primarily because he was American, but because he loved liberty, something like that?
Yes.
I mean, he has a very strong liberty component.
The liberty component, which is also an anti-slavery component.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, the most famous speech, I suppose, in American history, and maybe in modern history. I don't know.
And around the world. I mean, the
world.
speech has standing around the world. It's certainly in the top 5.
And the Gettysburg Address, delivered at Gettysburg, November 19th, is that my memory right? 1863.
Yes.
And so, very short. That's the most striking thing about it, right?
Yes.
Intentionally so. So what does Lincoln intend by this? And let's just go through it. It's only 3 paragraphs, so we can actually look at the text.
Okay. Yes, intentionally so, in a couple of ways. Partly, he's not the main speaker. Right. Edward Everett is the main speaker, and he gives a very long address, a 2-hour address. Lincoln is just asked to give some appropriate closing remarks, so there's a limitation there that the organizers have put upon him. But it also seems to me, I mean, you see it also in the second inaugural. It's the shortest inaugural. It's the shortest inaugural ever. So Lincoln is moving towards this kind of brevity and concision. And it's also connected, the brevity of it is connected with the claim that he makes about the status of words as compared to deeds. Now, people often read that sentence as ironic, right? The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And they note the irony of the fact that this is a very famous speech.
Right.
And this must be, students think, well, this must be false modesty on his part. But I actually think it's quite sincere and a little risky in a certain way. They've been there for about 3 hours at this point. Everett's 2-hour speech, you had these long prayers, you had other intervening things. And Lincoln is speaking at the end of that. So he says, the world will little note no longer remember what we say here. So not just what, he's not using we as the royal we. He's saying what we've all been doing here for the last 3 hours, nobody's going to remember that.
Right.
And in fact, no one does remember Edward Everett's speech. And it's also the case that if the Union had not been victorious in the war, I suspect even Lincoln's speech would not be much remembered. So I think he is serious about the priority of deeds over speeches at this moment. Right? He is using words, but he is using words to inspire deeds, and even what he says about dedication and devotion, even that is not enough, right? That dedication and devotion have to be turned into resolve. back with Franklin's virtue of resolution, right? It has to be turned into action. In fact, you could, I think, reformat this speech as a resolution. You have a series of whereas clauses, and then a be it resolved that.
Okay, well, let's go through that. That's interesting. No, you're right. I mean, in the second inaugural, which we'll get to it another time maybe, is that wonderful sentence about upon the progress of our
arms.
Yes. Everything
Yes.
depends upon the progress of our
Right.
arms, and that's going satisfactorily, and the war is about to end. So yeah, so we don't need to talk about that. But it is just in passing. But of course, he was very not just resolution, but actual victory is kind of important if you're fighting for self-government, right? It's not all the nice speeches don't solve it if the forces of slavery wins the Civil War,
Yeah, so that always has to be remembered. I mean, he is such a wordsmith, and it's so wonderful just to study the words, but words play a role in statesmanship, but prudence and making the right decision at the right time are maybe more important.
Winning the battle at Gettysburg's maybe more important than the speech at Gettysburg, right? Or makes possible maybe the speech at Gettysburg. So
although at the same time, I then want to turn and go through this,
let's go through it.
word by word.
Okay,
and,
just go. There are 3 paragraphs, really,
giving
right?
us a kind of definition of America and an account of the meaning of the war and the
so the speech, just to get clear, it's written out. He's seems to have worked on it fairly carefully. So it's to be taken, and then he supervises. I think it's printing too. So he's
Lincoln did not like to speak extemporaneously.
So this is a text.
Yeah, he didn't write it on the back of the envelope on the way up to Gettysburg.
That's right.
It's clear he'd been testing out and trying versions of some of these phrases already.
Okay, so you read the first paragraph, and then we'll talk about it.
Okay. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Okay. A lot to be said about that. Well, just the obvious, 77 years ago, so that's 1776.
Don't jump so quickly.
Okay.
How did you know that?
I just did the math. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. There are actually 3 mathematical operations involved.
Okay.
Right? 4 times 20.
Correct.
Plus 7.
Right.
Gives you 87.
Right.
Then you have to subtract.
Right.
87 from 1863
right.
to get to 1776. So by the time anyone in the audience had done the calculation, this speech would be over.
Oh yeah.
You would miss the speech if you did the mathematical calculation.
But the speech as a whole is intended to be read and memorized
True,
for many decades, not simply to be listened to, right?
But it does raise an interesting question. I mean, why didn't he just say in 1776?
I haven't thought about that, but you go first.
Okay. I mean, students sometimes just say, well, this is more poetic.
Biblical sounding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that it? I mean, well, what do you think?
It is more poetic, but yeah, that can't be the full answer.
Right. So what?
Well, the biblical resonance is important. I think that Leon Cass has made this point very nicely. According to the Bible, the lifespan of a human being is the natural lifespan of a human being is 70.
Right.
So 77.
A little more.
Is more than that.
Right.
So that means that there is no one in the audience here who could have been alive at the time of the Revolution. So he's really, in a way, going back to the Lyceum Address, that problem of living history. And so it raises the question, what is the relationship between the lifespan of a nation and the lifespan of an individual, especially since the nation may perish.
Right.
Right.
Our fathers. So that also fits with that, I think.
Yeah, so
he
is tapping into that kind of reverence or piety. Although he also seems to be saying, I mean, many of the people in the audience are immigrants. They were not, it's not their biological fathers. So, and he doesn't say the founding fathers.
Right.
He in a way seems to be saying that all Americans can lay claim to the founding fathers as our fathers.
Right. I think the hour is important there right at the beginning, as opposed to, as you say, the founding fathers or something like that.
Right.
But also, it does put it very much in the past. I mean, don't you think the whole thrust of that first paragraph is almost to extend it into the past even more than it really was, since it was, only 87 years ago before then. But 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth has a vague sense of, like, in olden times.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which I think is important for the whole speech, right?
It is, because this speech moves in a linear fashion through the past. The opening paragraph is about the past, situated there. The second paragraph, now we are engaged. You move directly into the present moment. Right. And then the very end of the speech, with the use of the future tense, the nation shall have a new birth of freedom. So it moves from past, present to future.
What else? The first paragraph?
Well, maybe just raise a question. Why does he use the language of generation and birth? He doesn't use the language, really, of revolution.
Or reasoning.
Yeah.
I mean, self-evident truth becomes a proposition. But even before that, as you say, our fathers brought forth a new nation conceived in liberty, which has...
Yeah.
Right.
It's a beautiful phrase. It's a little unclear what it means.
Yeah. Well, conceived can mean both, I suppose, right? The conceptual, thought about.
An idea.
Right.
Yes, ideas are...
Or conceived in the more biological
Yes,
sense.
so he seems to be playing on that imagery, and actually different moments. Conception comes before birth. Right? So the nation is conceived in liberty, and then the nation is brought forth.
Right.
That's the birth moment, right? And what's birthed is a new nation.
Right.
And then dedicated, that looks forward. Right? Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So you could argue that you actually have here conception, birth, and baptism. Right. The nation is given a certain guidance or direction by the founding fathers, placed on a certain pathway. It's also a suggestion that liberty and equality, those are the sort of two founding ideas, and you have to think about what the relationship between them is.
That's good. Okay.
Yeah.
There's more that we could say, but we'll go to the second paragraph.
Oh, but we're nowhere near done with the first paragraph.
Okay, go right ahead, please.
Well, I think should say something about the use of the word proposition.
Yeah.
In the Declaration, it is said to be a self-evident truth, that all men are created equal. A self-evident truth is an axiomatic truth, a truth that doesn't need to be proven and, in fact, can't be proven. Remember, we know that Lincoln was a student of Euclid. As an adult, he put himself through the first 6 books of Euclid. He was very well aware of the difference between an axiom and a proposition. And there are other places in Lincoln's writing where he describes the principles of the Declaration as the axioms of free society.
Yeah, that's right.
Jefferson's principles are the definitions and axioms of free society. So here he instead describes it as a proposition. And there are some who argue that this is highly significant. He has really taken that truth and put it now in a different category. And we'd have to ask why he does it. I guess my reading of it is that I don't think that Lincoln has changed his mind about the self-evidence of that truth. But he knows that political truths are not quite like mathematical truths, and political truths have to be held to be true. Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, and it's perfectly clear that at least half the nation is no longer holding those truths to be self-evident. So it's as if it has now shifted into the category of a propositional truth that requires a demonstration, requires a proof.
In practice.
Yeah. And again, you see the emphasis on action.
Yeah.
Right. This poses a dilemma for us in this generation.
Right. No, I think that's very true. I've always thought that the normal, so to speak, emphasis, which is understandable, on these truths are self-evident, these truths to be self-evident, misses the importance that we hold. It's extremely important that it begins that way.
Yeah.
And very uncharacteristically, in the first couple of paragraphs of the Declaration, which are mostly in the third person, a people should, separate itself and blah, blah, blah. Then it's suddenly that we hold, and that's really suggests that the truth is a truth, of course. But
it is a truth. It's not just
not simply a truth.
Our truth, but it
also has to be our truth, which makes it slightly less
and
more problematic as maybe a mere truth, if I can
So these are truths, but we are the ones who hold them to be self-evident.
Right. That's our doctrine, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. So
paragraph
second paragraph.
2, after permission. Okay.
All right. Are you going to read it aloud?
Okay. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this.
This is another one of the, I think, structural elements of the speech. So it does unfold in a linear way, past, present, and future, but it has other structural elements as well. And this test is part of that structure. So I think there are actually 3 tests. So there is the test of that nation, in other words, that nation as I have just defined it. That's interesting. He doesn't say this nation or our nation. He says that nation. I think he does that because he means not whatever nation you're thinking about, but that nation as I have just defined it. Those 30 words that explain what happened at the time of the founding. So what's being tested is whether that nation can survive, but also whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated, he repeats both the liberty and the equality, right? Whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure, so it's a test of popular government altogether. If the American experiment fails, it was sort of the most privileged instance of self-government. If we can't make a go of it, then we really might have to give up on popular government. And then I think there is a third test as well, but I'll hold off on that until we get to the third paragraph. And the solution, right, to these tests is given in the final sentence of the speech. Right? If we resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, government of the people by the people shall not perish, that is the solution to the test.
I've always been struck by the or any nation. So conceived and so dedicated, and Federalist One toys with that thought too. But it's not. It can't strictly be true or be provably true. And it could just be. I mean, if one were sitting in England, I'm making this up, I was in 1865, one could have said, look, they had this particular problem of this institution of slavery getting very deeply embedded very quickly, and then they mismanaged it, arguably, let's just say, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So it fell apart and it didn't survive. Life's full of failed experiments, and not to be too glib about it, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't, in happier circumstances, show that self-government, or as Federalist One puts it, government by reflection and choice, or government conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality, couldn't survive. It's interesting that Lincoln he really wants to make the universal claim here, or seem to make the universal claim. It's not necessary, is what I'm saying, though. I mean, he may think it's necessary, but it's not obviously necessary.
Yeah, I guess I would say that for him, yes, slavery is hugely important. But there is, in a way, a deeper issue at work.
Right.
And that is the subscription to law and majority rule. So won't there always be something that comes along that will make it difficult to subscribe to the will of the majority? So again, we're sort of back with the reverence for the law.
No, I think that's true. I just think, and I think it's fair enough to say that slavery, it'll always be something like, if you will, slavery to be as an obstacle in the way of self-government succeeding. Because that's more broadly the passions and the passion to take advantage of others and so forth. But I also think it's important rhetorically, though, for Lincoln, as it was in the founding, too, to make this almost more universalistic in significance than probably strict logic would allow, I would say, because that also allows you to appeal to the pride of Americans, that you're doing something of universal significance, not just, hey, keep that country that these guys started 7 years ago going. Well, that's not.
There's more at stake.
Yeah. The more at stake, I'd say, is actually an inducement towards moderation and towards more, more thoughtful governance in a funny way. I mean, the immoderation of the claim is, I believe,
is actually supports moderation.
Yes, the universal claim in a way, because that makes you say, well, I can't, we can't risk everything here, or it's worth the sacrifice of the Civil War, Anyway, whatever.
That's nice.
Okay, so we met on the Great Battle. I mean, he goes out of his way, I would say most obviously in this paragraph, though it's true of the whole speech, never to mention there's no proper noun in the speech with the possible exception of God.
God and liberty, which is capitalized and in a way personified.
Right.
Yeah.
So liberty at the beginning, God at the end. Nothing about the actual battle, nothing about here it's beautiful Pennsylvania on this fall day here in Pennsylvania, none of the normal stuff you would see in a speech at a battlefield. Right?
It is incredibly abstract. Right. So it's not the United States of America, it's just a new nation. Right? It's not America, it's this continent. There is no mention of the Union.
Right.
There is no mention of the enemy. The enemy are present only by implication, right? This is a national cemetery. It's a cemetery for the Union dead. And so he says, we've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that nation might live. In other words, there are others who gave their lives that the nation might perish. So they are there by implication. I do think that the very stripped down and abstract character of the speech is part of what accounts for its lasting character and its ability to speak to people in many different nations and in many different eras. In other words, every generation, every citizen of a popular government can read this and somehow identify with this. He's saying there are always tasks for the present generation.
And I think, don't you think, and future generations of Americans, many of whom were going to be immigrants or children of immigrants, as Lincoln himself knew, having spoken to that issue quite a lot in the 1850s, it's easier for them to memorize this speech and make this the speech about America than if it's going on about these particular, then you just, then the descendants of the Civil War soldiers get sort of special pride of place, and Lincoln seems very much not to want that to be the case, as it were. No daughters of the American Revolution, or what was this? They did set up that organization after the Civil War, actually, whatever it was, the Grand Army or something, which was sort of veterans organization to lobby for benefits for Civil War veterans. But this cuts very much against all that, I think.
Yeah.
You don't have to have been physically in Gettysburg. You don't have to.
Right. You just have to subscribe to this understanding of that nation.
Right. But I do think makes it possible for people, to memorize it in public schools in New York in the 1930s, when very few of those people's parents or grandparents were around in 1863.
Also, the fact that it contains only 130 distinct words. So there are 272 words in the speech, but only 130 distinct words. So many words are repeated. That's another kind of structural element of the speech, is the repetition of certain words, especially the word here. Here, 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 here. And repetition of other words like dedicate and consecrate. nation.
It makes it easier to memorize, among other things, though.
Yeah.
I mean, both the brevity and the repetition, probably.
Yeah, although
Or the
there are
simplicity of the
some
word.
unusual things with the syntax that can make it difficult to memorize accurately. So the
Yes.
placement of the heres is sometimes a little bit unusual, and the placement of words like rather is a little bit unusual. So Lincoln was a very good grammarian. He was a terrible speller, but he was a very good grammarian.
Is that right? He was a bad
And-
speller?
Yeah, he's bad speller, because that's just conventional. But grammar is logical, and so he's very interested in grammar.
That's interesting.
And there's maybe we can just do that, the funny grammar thing that
Yeah,
he
sure.
does in the second paragraph here. So if you look at the subjects of the sentences, right? Now, we are engaged, we are met, we have come to dedicate. So it's we. And then you have the concluding sentence. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. This is something called a dummy it, or an anticipatory it. So the subject that it stands in for is that we should do this.
Right.
That we should do this is altogether fitting and proper. And again, it's so do this, right? It doesn't use words like cemetery, for instance, right?
Right.
It's just field and resting place. So the effect of this grammatical structure is actually to throw the weight of the sentence on the word that comes after the verb. The word that comes after the verb is altogether. It is altogether.
Yeah.
So it actually, the way the emphasis works is we all together.
Yeah.
So it's a beat that has an effect on you, right? Even though he's using altogether not to mean all of us together, right? But I think it creates that sense that we are all in this together. We all
good.
together.
I've always been struck that that last sentence is, I mean, it's not obvious why it's there. That is, the speech would read fine without the last sentence. In fact, it would read a little better in a funny way, because it goes from, we've come to dedicate a portion of this field, and then the third paragraph begins, but in a larger sense we cannot dedicate. So it's I'd say it's an obtrusive
It's an
sentence.
interjection in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, I think he has to do that because he wants to say, well, he has to do it because the third paragraph actually reverses direction.
Right.
The but means I'm taking back what I just said, right?
Okay.
And so he has to say it is fitting and proper that we should do this, right? It is right to be here acknowledging our debt to the dead soldiers, to their sacrifice, their blood sacrifice. So I think he feels he has to give them that. But he's going to pivot in the next paragraph.
Yeah, that's not, I think, usually noticed. Okay, so let's go to the
Yeah,
but and the next paragraph.
I have argued in print that this is the most significant use of the word but in the English language.
Right.
So, elementary school teachers tell you not to start a sentence with but, certainly not to start a paragraph with but.
Right.
But Lincoln does it. So why does he do it? And I think this points to the real problem that he's addressing. So there's the problem of national survival, there's the problem of the survival of popular government, but there is the problem that he is facing as president, and that's the problem of Northern morale, the problem of grief. So at Gettysburg, you have the Union dead are 3,500, there are more Confederate dead, and there are 50,000 casualties. It's the highest casualty rate of the war. 1/3 of the fighting men on the field were casualties in that battle, dead, wounded, missing. And this is not just, 1 week, but week after week after week, the drumbeat of these horrific battles. Right after the victory at Gettysburg, the New York draft riots break out. And there are, I think, 120 dead in the New York draft riots. And the Gettysburg veterans of Gettysburg have to be sent north. They're taken off the quest for Lee and sent north to quell the disturbances in New York City. There were those who said that the draft riots turned the victory at Gettysburg into a Confederate victory. Mm-hmm. So this is a war speech that has to rally the nation. So it's rather like what, in a certain way, what Pericles does in the funeral oration. There is this problem of grief. And so he, as gently as he can, has to tell the mourners that they cannot do what they came to do. Or they can't do what they came to do if they remain there tarrying among the graves. Right? Lamentation is not what is called for. So in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. Right? They did it, the brave men. They have consecrated it. Then the statement that we've already discussed about the world, right? And then he goes back to that same grammatical formulation. It is, right? That deferred it. It is for us, the living, rather. Right? The two rathers in the final two sentences pick up the but. He's still in that sort of adversative mode. And the effect of the deferred it is to put the emphasis on what comes after the verb. In other words, for us. That's where the emphasis is. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated. So he really is using his sophisticated knowledge of grammar to move the audience.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, the but. Well, let's just finish that up, and then I want to come back for a minute to the larger sense, because that can't just be about the morale of the North, though. In November of 1863, I guess the speech also has that so much longer horizon, so to speak. So I mean,
yeah,
Isn't he also sort of qualifying what, as you said earlier, what's come before? It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, he doesn't have to say that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it maybe he doesn't want to be quite so bald-faced in saying, you can't do what you came here to do. That's
right.
A bit of a slap in the face to them. But you're right that this, I think it does point forward to the current generation,
right.
which means also to every current generation
right.
that reads this speech. So that's part of the larger sense. I mean, you can see this all the way back in the Lyceum Address. No generation wants to think of itself as the epigones. Right? The task of self-government must be ongoing.
Right, and almost more even of a task now, or as much certainly, maybe more though than at the beginning. That's very consistent.
Yeah,
with
so
Lyceum.
That's why eventually the Lyceum Address, it seems to me, argues that the task of perpetuation is a higher task, a more difficult task than the task of founding.
So in a funny way, speaking of D-Day, since as we did earlier, I mean, this in a way is the opposite of the Greatest Generation rhetoric, which I've always sort of thought was both wonderful and deserved tribute, but in a certain way problematic, because it's sort of, well, they were the greatest, and we're kind of, tooling along, and of course we'll never do anything like D-Day, which we probably won't, but certainly won't. But we're sort of doing our best also to keep the peace and keep the world order together and so forth. But it's something that's not quite right somehow from the point of view of democratic leadership, right?
Yeah, because there was a kind of necessity that they were facing.
Right, but you don't want to be too nostalgic, I guess is what I'm saying. I mean, Lincoln doesn't say, he could have said, these are the greatest, we will never live up to their standards. That's a standard kind of thing to say at a cemetery, frankly, and it's sometimes true, and true, and maybe true in this case, incidentally. I mean, but but it is very striking how forward-looking he gets, if I can use that term, in those last two sentences in particular.
Yeah.
At a dedication of a cemetery for a battlefield, which is unusual, I'd say.
Yeah.
And not just in some ritualistic way of, and therefore we have to do our best to keep, the normal thing you might say, someone would say. But really, as you say, it is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here.
Yes.
But
So
us, the living, is really kind of startling when you think about it for a minute, too. Right?
yeah, they're dead and gone.
The brave men living and
Yeah.
dead who struggled here have consecrated it, but it's for us, the living, rather to be dedicated to the unfinished work which they fought here.
Yeah. So if we get to that last
Yep.
sentence, maybe the
Yep,
longest
do.
one,
Yep.
longer by a great deal than any of the other sentences here, and quite complicated. In fact, there's a wonderful website that you can go to where you can see this sketched out. You know, what do you call that when you do the sentence diagramming?
Diagrams, yeah.
Yes,
Is that right?
a sentence diagram of this last sentence of the Gettysburg Address. It's phenomenal. So it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause. So he's shifting to the cause, right? The cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. So the first thing that dedication will do will be to increase devotion to the cause. But then you get the three resolves that we here highly resolve, right? So dedication and devotion have to turn into resolve. Resolve three things: that these dead shall not have died in vain. So that does look back to them, right? We don't want their sacrifice to be wasted. Second, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. I have to talk about what that means and how it relates to the conceived in liberty. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So two of these are shall nots. Right? So they shall not have died in vain, and so that government shall not perish, free government shall not perish from the earth. And one of them is a shall, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom.
Which is certainly the most powerful, the most emphatic of the three, I would say. Or the most striking
Yeah.
of the three, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So that's this nation,
Yeah, now he shifted from that nation to this nation.
right? He inserted under God, I guess, in the
He did.
late
That
in the
does
drafting.
seem to be late, although in the final text that he supervised, it was there.
Right.
And it's there in all of the journalistic accounts.
Right, so he thought-
The transcriptions that were taken at the time.
Yeah. So shall have a new birth. So the new birth of freedom, that's the most famous phrase in the speech,
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we try to tie this back to the first paragraph, one thing we might notice, this other structural element that is now clear. You began with language of birth. The whole middle section is about death, and resting place, and burial grounds, and then new birth of freedom. So there's a linear movement, but there's also a cyclical movement: birth, death, rebirth, and possibly rebirth at a higher level. So a kind of perhaps Christian imagery of being born again.
Right.
So in the first paragraph, what was born was the nation. It was a new nation.
Right.
But what's born now is actually freedom.
That's good.
It's a new birth of freedom. Often we use liberty and freedom as synonyms. I think it's possible that Lincoln is not simply using them as synonyms. There's a reason he shifts from liberty to freedom. So if it's now freedom that is actually born, how is that? What does that mean? One thing that it means, that the Emancipation Proclamation has already been in effect for almost a year, and there are already great numbers of freedmen who are fighting for the Union, wearing the Union blue, and it's clear that if the Union wins, slavery will be at an end, completely at an end. So partly the new birth of freedom is an extension of freedom, 4 million new freedmen. So I think that's part of its meaning, but I think it also means that if the nation succeeds in vindicating the majority principle and really showing that once you've agreed to be bound by ballots, you must continue to be bound by ballots. There's no recourse back to bullets. That itself will be a new birth of freedom. So that you could say that what the New Birth of Freedom does is to finally bring together what was a little bit separated in the first paragraph, or a little bit separated at the time of the founding. Conceived in liberty, dedicated to equality. But those two things were not coterminous or completely at one with each other at the time of the founding. The New Birth of Freedom would now bring together liberty and equality. We would really be living out the principles of the Declaration in their intertwinedness. Right? If you really understand what equality requires, then you understand what consent means. And you have put consent on its proper foundation of the recognition of equality.
Yeah, that's good. We should bring this to a close here and resume Lincoln in another conversation, but maybe some thoughts on this, but then certainly the second inaugural and other things. But why do you think it ends? I've always thought that the end's beautifully, I mean, as a kind of matter of cadence, it's a beautiful ending, but it's a little bit of a letdown almost,
a downer.
Don't you think? It's
well,
from the heights of the New Birth of Freedom.
Yeah.
Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, that's great, but shall not perish is a fairly, it's not sort of, shall stride triumphantly into the future or something.
Yeah, but this is part of Lincoln's conservatism. He always manages to be utterly conservative and utterly liberal, and to combine those in the proper balance. So there's a kind of balance here of the shall nots and the shalls. And it's not nothing for government of, by, and for the people to not perish. Right? That itself is highly is a high accomplishment. We should maybe just say something about under God.
Yeah, please.
What we're to make of that, and whether that plays a role in the New Birth of Freedom or not. What would it mean for the nation to be under God? The reference to the divine in the first paragraph comes from the Declaration. All men are created equal. There's a creator God. But that doesn't mean necessarily a providential God or a God that's active in human history. Whereas if the nation is now under God, under the superintendence of God, and maybe God is now informing our sense of the limits of human freedom, that might enter into what a new birth of freedom would be. A kind of freedom that is not licensed to do anything, licensed to hold slaves, for instance.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, that's actually an appropriate thing to end this conversation on, because under God points forward in that respect to the second inaugural, which in so many ways is so different, I always think, from Gettysburg, but obviously does have a real reflection on the whole question of what politics under God would
We'll do the theological political question next time.
Well, I really look forward to it. And Diana, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Bill.
And thank you for joining us on Conversations.